Greetings. This is Magi Mysteries. My name is John Savers. I'm your host, and today we will continue with our delightful The Marks of Israel. For those of you new to Magi Mysteries, let me just say that this is a program which focuses on the Israelitish Christian line, both biblically speaking and also the witnesses in the world at large. So with that a piece of information, you are now forearmed. Let us now proceed. We have been talking about the marks. We've gotten into the vicinity of the 12th mark. We just concluded about the matter of circumcision of the heart. We have had pointed out that circumcision of the flesh alone is not sufficient to the task, but circumcision of the heart is sufficient to the task. In other words, without circumcision of the heart, circumcision of the flesh is just mutilation. So on that note, we do want to proceed. But before we do get to our guide, Sheldon Emry, per se, I do again want to kind of touch on an area of interest. We have talked about the people of the seed of Abraham being quite numerous, with metaphors of stars and sand and being countless and so forth. Now, we think that this is all quite accurate, actually, not in an exact sense of grains of sand, because we all know how incredibly numerous they are. But we do think that what actually occurred is a resounding affirmation of the biblical line, and as such, the enemies of the biblical line, the anti-Yahweh, anti-Yeshua, anti-Bible people, are resolute in their rejection of this wonderful truth. Now, they are armed with all the great eggheads of all the great universities who are impressively prolix in this area and that. The one area in which they are weak is the area known as truth. So we do note this, and we do say to the congregations of Christians, do not be daunted by these eggheads with their very clever tongues and so forth, for they are enemies of truth. Now, I did want to say, in conjunction or connection with this mark of Israel, the great numbers, that, and we did touch on this in the last episode, but we also wanted to bring into your present mind that there is plenty of information in regard to Israel and the great empires or powerful people known as the Scythians and the Parthians. Now, the Parthians were, for the most part, the Israelites who are moved east of Assyria. They are thought of and considered by all the people who are contemporary with them and who study the history, the great classic historians and so forth, to be basically Scythians, to be the same people. Now, it might be noted here that at the time, and by all people who lived at the time, and by written informations by the most powerful of Romans, Parthia was considered an equal and second power on earth during the time of the Roman Empire at its greatest. That is, Parthia was not inferior to, but it was equal to and held its own in battles and every kind of confrontation. The battle line seemed to be the Euphrates. This seems to be the primary line which separates the jurisdiction of the great empire Parthia from that of the Roman Empire. Parthia really became, or started to become, a great power with the overcoming of the Greek Seleucid power and the cracking up of the regions left by the death of Alexander the Great. Now, it may also be said that Alexander the Great may have been of a Israelitish or Hebrew descent himself. He is someone who is described as fair with reddish hair, and he has the complexion and the look and so forth that seem to be consistent with the Adamic people and the Israelitish people, and we think it's quite possible that this happened to be the case. Macedonia, Macedon. Again, we see Don, Macedon. We think it's possible that this is so, but it's not easily proved. Still, we call it to your attention. After the great Alexander the Great empire dissolved, Parthia became a great empire. And at the same time, Rome became a great empire. And of course, they did collide. And as I mentioned, Parthia held its own. It's interesting to note that Parthia is a nation or empire whose name signifies the covenant people in every sense that the name Britain does. The linguistic connection between P's and B's, they're basically interchangeable, makes this more apparent. If you spell Parthia with a B, you have the very same Hebrew letters, B-R-T, that you have with the British B-R-T, and again you have covenant. This is the covenant people. This is Israel. This is the seed of Isaac. And there are any other number of similar markers, just as there are in Carthage, by the way, and other colonies of the Hebrews, that this was so. Now, the Western egghead types like to refer to Carthage as a Phoenician empire and so forth, but Phoenicia pretty much flourished about the same time that the great Israel empires did, and it's quite sure that Israel dominated Phoenicia and those city-states, and we feel that the best that can be said for Phoenicia is that it was an ally of the kingdom, the empire of Israel. And some say that Phoenicia itself may have been primarily of the tribe of Dan. But at any rate, people get confused because other people give a name to a people. This is not the name they gave themselves necessarily, but a name that somebody else gave them, and then the Western eggheads, resistant and hating Israel and God and the Bible and so forth, leap at the opportunity to use it. But at any rate, the markers are everywhere. It's great, it's impressive, it's powerful, it's truth willing. Now, the first king of the Parthian Empire was named Arsaxes. And again, we have that S-A-C as the second syllable, A-R-S-A-C, E-S, I believe it is. But at any rate, you have, again, that line of Isaac. Always amongst these people, you run into Sakai, and so forth. You get Saxons. You get suck in one way or another with these people, but you also get a notice that the line also is connected with the Davidic line of Judah. As you know, probably, Judah was given the scepter, but Israel was given the promises, the inheritance. That is, Ephraim, Manasseh, and this was shown by the blessing given by Jacob to the two sons of Joseph. So at any rate, it is to this people that we would look to the inheritance, to the promises and so forth, and the connecting names, and we think that to their kings we would look quite possibly for signs of the Davidic kingdom. And they are there particularly, and it has been noted. Now, I do intend to do programs which elaborate on this and give citations so it's quite apparent, but believe me, it's there. Now, this particular kingdom at one time stretched all the way from West India to the Euphrates, up beyond the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, and the Urals to a rather eastern position, and it was an immense power. Now, not everyone who was part of the Parthian Empire was an Israelite. The Israelites, the Parthians, utilized pretty much the same technique which had been used by some of the benign leaders of empires of the past, and included that would be Alexander the Great, which is to allow the kingdoms to be autonomous, to have their own kings as long as they pay their tribute and offered soldiers and so forth. Now, great historians such as Gibbon have noted that the Parthians had a feudal system which in many, many points was precisely the same sort of feudal system that was to be found in Europe during the Middle Ages. And point of fact, those people who are Israelites and Christians and so forth do have a legitimate feudal relationship with their God. That is, for serving their God, they expect to have the protection of that God. There are rules and regulations between both God and his servant people, his vassals, and this makes for the relationship, if one or the other fails in the covenant, the feudal relationship, then it pretty much is ended. And of course we know that God is not going to welch on his end of it, only humans do. But at any rate, the main point is that again, you have witnesses, continuations, generational reproductions of the same ways of doing things, whether it be in Parthia or whether it be in the farthest reaches of West Europe. So we do call this to your attention. Now, I had mentioned at one point how the Scythians, who were always considered a kinfolk to the Parthians, and whenever the Parthians were in need of assistance of a military type, a warlike type, they would call upon their relatives, the Scythians, to help, and the Scythians invariably did. Now, it is noted in a text I have that on one occasion the Scythians got there late, the Parthians had already won, and the Parthians had decided that they would not share their booty with the Scythians, and the Scythians considered this to be an outrage, and they set to fighting each other, and it was almost a reproduction, a recreation of the fight between Ephraim and Manasseh in the Bible on a similar ground. That is, Ephraim came late and wanted its share, and Manasseh said, no, you didn't do any actual fighting, and so they commenced to fight. It's not unusual for the tribes to fight each other. We know that the tribe of Benjamin was almost annihilated at one point by the others. and it's too bad that this happens, but generally speaking, overwhelmingly so, the Parthians and the Scythians acted in a very friendly way and helped one another. And if a Parthian king had to run for it, he ran to Scythia for protection. So we call this all to your attention. Also, it might be noted as an interesting point, which is completely consistent with the European point of view, particularly the Anglo-Saxon, and that is for the Parthian, the shaking of the hand, the right hand, was like an oath. It was like an inviolable contract. You gave your right hand, you shook hands, it's a done deal. Your honor, everything was sealed by that handshake. Now, the Parthians actually tried to do this on their first occasion with a kind of a tussle with Rome, in which they actually helped the Romans in Armenia, and a handshake was involved, and then the Romans cheated them and so forth, and this was an eye-opener for the Parthians, and they never did offer their hand again in that sense. In fact, I think Crassus had his right hand cut off as well as his head as a symbol to give to Rome about the Parthians' view toward them and their honesty. Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful story of the Israelites and also the Judahites who were in that particular area and who knew each other and so forth. It's often been said that Jews acted as spies both before the Romans and for the Parthians. We think those Jews were Babylonian Jews for the most part. We think that they were acting as double agents, and we think they were helping the Parthians. But at any rate, they didn't tell the Romans. But let's go on now with our marks. The 12th mark is in the 18th chapter of Genesis. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him." Genesis 18:17 through 19. This is a mark of Israel. They were to keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment. This mark was passed on to Isaac and Jacob Israel. Which nation or nations have that mark upon them? Which ones try to do righteousness according to God's way or God's law? Is it Jewish-occupied Palestine, or is it America? Who in America are the great violators of God's law? Who attempt to teach and do injustice and unrighteousness? It is the Jewish people. This is a citation from the best of Sheldon Emry, The Marks of Israel, pages 17 and 18. Well, I believe that there are any number of instances that one could adduce to substantiate the charge of Sheldon Emry here. But all one needs to really do is recall Judge Moore and his putting the Ten Commandments outside the courthouse, I believe in Alabama, possibly Georgia, I forget a little bit. But at any rate, this little gesture of kind of touching base with one's ancestral people, one's God, the notions of justice and righteousness and so forth, was attacked by one of the well-known organized Jewish groups. This is not uncommon. We think it's anomalous. We don't think Israel would do that, but to each his own. We think the whole idea of the separation of religion and the public, the polity of the people is incorrect. but we have in control of the United States, and in a group which spans the United States is an shadowy oligarchy which has visible viziers such as the Rockefeller family and their Raj here, and the other circles of power, to use a favorite expression of the old USSR officials here, and it's quite clear that whatever they have in mind, it's not going to be keeping God's law, God's righteousness, God's justice, as we would understand it as Israelitish Christian people. But they have another something in mind. What is it? Well, I think it's, again, a perversion of actual facts and events, which is based on a Gnostic, a hidden Gnostic sort of knowledge, position, impel. Now, it's known, for instance, that the Lucis Trust, it used to be called the Lucifer Trust, set up in this country. It basically is derivative of British Freemasonry, and it has as many members people such as Walter Cronkite, Ted Turner, Bishop Moore. He is from a very prominent family, Rabbi Tannenbaum, the Rockefellers, and so forth. Now, this is a crowd that seems to think of themselves as enlightened. I think they look to Lucifer, at least in a symbolic sense, as a god. They look to Prometheus and so forth. Prometheus, of course, is a great hero of the rebellious crowds, but what was Prometheus but a thief and an enemy of the gods? So he's punished. He's thought to be a friend of man, but if you're a friend of man, how can it be that you would bring the wrath of God upon us? At any rate, it's quite big with them, and their whole attitude is antithetical toward God. But interestingly, within the degrees of the Illuminati is a group called Magus. It's about the fifth degree, I believe. And it's also interesting because I think Cronkite and Turner were reported to have laughingly referred to themselves as wise guys and so forth. This is sort of a vulgar translation of the word Magus. Now, Magus happened to be a very important position in the Parthian Empire setup. The Magi were the people who helped to make the kings. They are people who seem to be very much of a kin to the tribe of Levi. There were something like 80,000 of them in the Parthian Empire, and some cities in Parthia were exclusively populated by these Magi, much as some of the cities in the Holy Land were at one time exclusively the cities of the Levi. So we see again a touching base here on the one hand with the truth of the Bible and the correct way things should be done. And we see the perversion which comes through animosity toward this God and this people, and exemplified by such nuts as Ted Turner and Walter Cronkite and Rabbi Tannenbaum, the Rockefellers, Bishop Moore, et al. So these are the people that basically you are now looking up to as your leaders and people that you listen to with bated breath. And who has ever heard or read in the papers of a speech by Ted Turner who was not struck by the banality of what he said, the pedestrian ideas, the ideas that would really cause most people who can think to start slumbering off. You know, I've heard it so many times before, and it's incorrect to begin with. Well, that's it, folks. A wrap. We're out of time again. This is Magi and Mysteries. My name is John Savers. I'm your host. I do appreciate your tuning in and hope to see you again next time.